Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to rise and speak on Bill 12, which is an important piece of legislation without question. The Alberta Party and certainly myself very much support any effort to ensure that the Kinder Morgan pipeline is built. Whatever it takes is what we need to do to make sure that Alberta's products can get to global markets, that we get a pipeline built to Tidewater. And so we are broadly and generally supportive of this bill. I will say that it's a real shame that it has gotten to this point. It's unfortunate that the government has not pushed harder sooner to get the pipeline built and get the approvals in to ensure that their NDP colleagues in British Columbia were not more amenable to following the rule of law for a project that has been vetted and reviewed, probably the most thorough review of any project that I can certainly remember. Very comprehensive and professional review done by the National Energy Board, and the project was deemed to be in the national interest. It was deemed to be safe. 157 conditions were placed on Kinder Morgan in the construction of the pipeline, and Canada's world-leading regulatory system was again on display. We have the best regulatory system in the entire world. And so it is a shame that the province of British Columbia insists on throwing up legal roadblocks. And if that means that we need to adjust, shall I say, how and where and when we ship our natural resources, to perhaps send British Columbia a message that they should stop messing around with an approved project, then so be it. That is what I guess we'll have to do. You know, the part that's always puzzled me about the way that this government has approached the pipeline file is that the province of Alberta and this government's goals should be aligned with the goals of British Columbia, even before the NDP came into power in BC. The Trans Mountain Pipeline will have an environmental benefit, and this is something that has not been I think really even discussed much at all by this government. They had just simply hoped that by having a carbon tax, they would cross their fingers and hope that everyone would give them the social license to build a pipeline. Well, very clearly that's not happening. But by building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Alberta crude will displace heavy crudes from Venezuela and Nigeria, countries that have, frankly, an atrocious environmental track record. They have just a terrible human rights record, certainly don't have anywhere near the regulatory rigor and oversight that we do, and as a result, their crudes are on the market and ours is not. And as a result of their production methods, they're not investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in private capital, in energy efficiency and reducing the impact, the carbon emissions coming from the production of oil sands, of bitumen from Alberta's oil sands. We are, in this province, the most environmentally responsible, the most socially responsible, the most innovative oil and gas developing region in the entire world. That is something we ought to be absolutely proud of. And unfortunately, we had a government for years was sleepwalking through the process, just kind of hoping that somehow everything was going to be okay. What they should have been doing was early on pushing very, very, very hard to ensure that this project was built, and doing that by making the case not just government to government, but making the case to the people of British Columbia, making the case to the rest of the country for the benefit, not just the economic benefit, and make no mistake, there is a substantial economic benefit to, yes, the province of Alberta, but to the entire country from building pipelines. Huge, huge benefits economically, but there are equally environmental benefits to doing so that go far beyond the government's carbon tax. It is an absolute fact that by continuing to develop the oil sands, we will displace higher carbon sources of crude with Alberta crude. And the companies that are developing technologies to reduce carbon emissions and reduce the impact of the development of the oil sands, including the impact on fresh water, the impact on land use, on greatly reducing tailings, those technologies are applicable elsewhere in the world. As other countries try to reduce their carbon emissions, they will be using made-in-Alberta technologies to do so. Those technologies are going to be created in the pursuit of developing the oil sands. That is, I think, aligned with what the people of British Columbia want, with what the people of Canada want. That is the case that should have been being made by this government. They had a unique opportunity to do that because they, as the NDP, I would think should at least have some credibility on the environmental side. But unfortunately, they're a little late to the game. Now that they have none more fervent than the converted, I suppose, Madam Speaker, and so they're certainly hitting above their weight on this file now. And I suppose I'm relieved to see that they're doing that. That's good news. They are, I think, quite vigorously defending Alberta's interests now on the pipeline file. But I wish we could have said the same thing going back 3 years. And had we been able to say the same thing going back 3 years, I think that we would be in a much better position as it relates to the Kinder Morgan pipeline specifically, but also other pipeline projects, Energy East in particular. So it is a shame, Madam Speaker, that it has come to this. This bill does grant the government extraordinary powers to arbitrarily and without any stated compensation simply dictate to a shipper where and to whom and how they can move their product. That is not something I think that would be an ordinary power that government has. As a result, when the time comes, we intend to move an amendment to add a sunset clause into this bill. This is not the sort of power that a government should have in perpetuity. It should expire at some point in the not-too-distant future. I'd certainly be happy to work with the government in determining what is an appropriate time for that sunset clause. And I think that's something that would certainly make industry a lot happier as well, to know that this sort of power will not exist in perpetuity, beyond the hopefully relatively short period of time it will take to actually get the Kinder Morgan pipeline built and operational. So I think that's important. We may also want to look at, now of course the sunset clause doesn't mean that the bill necessarily goes away. What it means is that it will expire unless renewed by the Legislative Assembly. So we as legislators would have the opportunity to renew the bill should we find at the time of the sunset clause or leading up to it that in fact it was necessary. The other piece I would think there should be more clarity on is what is the compensation plan should the government decide that they need to use this. This could potentially cost companies that have been operating in good faith within the bounds of the law, doing nothing more than plying their trade and moving Alberta's natural resources. There may be substantial financial impacts on those companies. And the government ought to look at compensation. I understand the minister has indicated that she has had some discussions with industry on that. That's obviously a good thing. But I would have liked to have seen some sort of model shared with the Assembly. And I would make that ask now officially and formally and on the record that the government does, in fact, give us some more insight, some more details in terms of what the compensation plan would be. So that's something that is also a question that I would hope as the debate rolls on, the government is able to provide for us. The other question I have is what impact would this have should the government choose to exercise these powers on agreements that suppliers have, agreements that shippers have with their suppliers, contractors, customers. They have a legal obligation to fulfill those contractual commitments to ship product. And if the government frustrates that, what happens? I don't know what I actually don't know what the impact of that would be on those agreements. Does that put the shipper, the company itself, the shippers themselves, offside with their contractual agreements that they have in place with their customers? So does that potentially expose them to, I guess, what we consider double jeopardy, where they're not allowed to ship the product, but they're contractually obligated to ship the product? And are they potentially opening themselves up to legal action or a compensation claim by their customers? So I don't know the answer to that question. I'd like the government please to weigh in on answers to those questions. As I say, I think the sunset clause is an important aspect of this, and I do look forward very much to bringing that forward when we get a chance. I'm again profoundly disappointed that the government has allowed us to get to this point and allowed this file to languish for as long as they have. They have stepped up to the plate now. We're debating a bill that hopefully will help us get a pipeline built. We have the government now forcefully defending Alberta's interests, and I'm glad to see that. But I would have liked to have seen that a lot earlier so we wouldn't find ourselves in this position. Thank you, Madam Speaker.